My name is Catherine Geddick-Soltis, and I serve as director of the Center for Peace and Justice Education, which hosts this annual keynote lecture as part of Villanova's commemoration of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During this commemoration, we reflect and expand upon the legacy of MLK, pursuing the justice which our time demands of each and every one of us. Tomorrow, throughout the day, we will explore MLK's legacy with the annual Freedom School. Students, staff, and faculty will be offering a tremendous range of sessions on topics including environmental justice, anti-racism, health equity, peace building and nonviolence, allyship, movement organizing, and intergroup dialogue. You can find the links for all of these sessions on our Freedom School webpage. Tonight, for our keynote lecture, we have the special privilege of hearing from Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who will offer remarks under the title, The Radical King and the Quest to Change America. Dr. Taylor, thank you for being with us this evening. I also want to express thanks to the various offices and programs that joined the Center for Peace and Justice Education and the Office for Mission and Ministry to make this keynote lecture possible. Gratitude goes out to the Office of the President, the Office of Student Life, the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication and Society, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Ethics Program, and the Office of Service Learning. I thank too the dedicated faculty and staff of the members of the Center for Peace and Justice Education, as well as the members of Villanova's MLK Committee, which is chaired with the consummate wisdom of Professor Carol Anthony. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Taylor, will be introduced tonight by my amazing colleague, Dr. Camille Berge. Dr. Berge is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and our Assistant Director in the Center for Peace and Justice Education. Following Dr. Taylor's remarks, we will have time for questions from you, our audience members. So please use the Q&A feature here in Zoom to submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can during our time together this evening. Now, before turning to Dr. Berge to introduce our speaker, I have the great honor of welcoming Villanova's president, Father Peter Donahue, who joins us tonight and has offered to share a few words as we gather for the university's annual MLK commemoration. Father Peter, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. Before we begin, I just want to welcome Dr. Taylor for joining us this evening and zooming into Villanova. We appreciate her presence with us, and we look forward to hearing what she has to call us to. It's wonderful that so many people are participating in this event. I think I see the participants over 500 right now. And as we come together to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Tonight's lecture is a wonderful way to celebrate Dr. King's vision for humanity, a vision that demonstrates the importance of community and strength to draw from one another, working together, learning together, and serving together. Using our skills and our knowledge and our Augustinian values to make positive impacts in our lives and in the lives of others. Dr. King once said, intelligence plus character is the goal of true education, which closely mirrors Villanova's mission. Villanova didn't simply seek intellectual or spiritual growth. We seek to reach out to full potential by growing as a whole person. This occurs not only by engaging our minds, but also our hearts, and by listening to each other with thoughtful hearts and open minds. Tonight's lecture is also an important celebration of what Dr. King believed in, having difficult discussions and creating meaningful dialogue. It's vital to understand ourselves and others. These are necessary conversations that we need to take place in our community, as evidenced by the Black at Villanova Instagrams and in our communities across the country. As St. Augustine taught us, only in community can you and I really achieve our true potential. Community begins by building relationships with one another, by engaging in dialogue, by revealing our pain, our fears, by celebrating our accomplishments, by embracing our differences, by challenging our preconceptions about one another. It's not easy to build a community of truth and unity and love, but together we try. It requires time, it requires energy, and it requires commitment. More importantly, it takes willingness to look honestly at ourselves and see the times when our actions fall short of our loftiest goals and our best intentions. I firmly believe that Villanova can be a place that embraces and evaluates and elevates all members of our community, regardless of gender, race, culture, faith, or orientation. And I am extremely grateful to the students, faculty, and staff in this room who have recognized this and create ways to further explore our diversity and inclusivity throughout our campus. Together, we have an opportunity to make a difference, to ignite change by opening doors and inviting conversations. It is through understanding and respect that true growth and social justice can change the way we live our lives. Thank you all for joining us. And Camille, take it away.
Thank you, Father Peter. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Professor Taylor is an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. She is the author of Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership, published in 2019 by the University of North Carolina Press, longlisted for a National Book Award for nonfiction, and a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer in history. Taylor's book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book in 2016. She is also editor of How We Get Free, Black Feminism, and the Combahee River Collective, which won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ nonfiction in 2018. Professor Taylor is a columnist for The New Yorker. Her writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Boston Review, Paris Review, Guardian, The Nation, and Souls, A Critical Journey of Black Politics, Culture, and Society, among many others. She's a former contributing opinion writer for The New York Times. In 2016, she was named one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the United States by The Root. In 2018, Essence magazine named her among the top 100 changemakers in the country. She's been appointed as a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians by the Organization of American Historians. Professor Taylor writes and speaks on Black politics, social movements, and racial inequality in the United States. Tonight, we'll have the pleasure of hearing Professor Taylor speak from the topic, The Radical King and the Quest to Change America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor.
Hello. Thank you so much. Just get this right here. I want to thank the folks at the Peace and Justice Center from Villanova for the invitation to come and talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King and, you know, what it really means in our contemporary struggles for racial justice in the United States. I'm probably going to talk for about 35 or 40 minutes, and I always like to say that I offer my words as a provocation. I think when talking about King, it should make us somewhat uncomfortable. And I hope that that compels us to think about the relevance of his ideas and politics in our society today. And I hope that that really is the spirit with which we kind of engage in a dialogue at the end of my remarks. So without further ado, I'll begin. In 1983, after years of lobbying by civil rights advocates and Coretta Scott King, the widow of Martin Luther King Jr., President Ronald Reagan, a sitting president, but a political opponent of King during his lifetime, agreed to sign legislation turning King's birthday into a national holiday. At the time of King's murder in 1968, Reagan made the callous and racist statements that described his death as a, quote, great tragedy that began when we began compromising with law and order and people started choosing which laws they'd break. Right-wing reactionaries had often reduced the Southern civil rights strategy of civil disobedience as simple lawlessness, or the struggles in the North as violating their norms of law and order. Reagan ended his remarks in 1968 by denigrating the concept of equality as outside the boundaries of the American dream when he said, quote, "The American dream that we have nursed so long is not that every man be level with every other man, but that every man may be free to become whatever God intended." So it was a moment of triumph as old segregationists and racists like Ronald Reagan, who had opposed King as a leader of the civil rights movement, twisted with fury with the national recognition of King as a celebrated American. But it was also a moment of tragedy as the formal canonization of King allowed for his very complicated politics to be defanged and defiled, twisted into hollow pleas for peace, justice, equality, and colorblindness. That was the trade-off. King could only be a national hero if he were stranded in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial in search of a world, quote, where his children would be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin, as he said in his I Have a Dream speech, essentially entombed in a casket of idolatry and impotence. The problem with how we remember King is not just the inaccuracy or distortions of his politics, but it is also how those distortions are used to rewrite the history of the civil rights movement, turning it into an endeavor that is intended to confirm the essential progressive trajectory of American history. In this way, the civil rights movement is remembered as a triumphant part of the American story of progress, instead of a movement that exposed the deep and abiding roots of American racism and the codification of second-class citizenship for African Americans. But neither the rise of King nor the emergence of the civil rights movement confirms the inherent progress motoring US history forward. Both King's political trajectory and the essentially radical nature of the civil rights movement confirm that in the United States, progress is not guaranteed. It is only the result of enduring social movements, labor movement, and struggle. Contemporary Black movements against institutional and entrenched racism show that the arc of American history is long and it bends towards racism and inequality. One need look no further than our current national dilemma of multiplying, metastasizing crises to know that progress is not the natural order of life in the United States. We are living through the aftermath of Donald J. Trump, President of the United States, having tried to lead a racist rebellion against a duly elected president to reimpose himself as the head of the country. Trump wielded the tools of racism, xenophobia, religious hatred, and a deep, abiding misogyny, all wound together in the rubric of white supremacy. But white supremacy has never existed for its own sake. It has always been yoked to a larger objective of social control to the benefit of white elites and more social control and manipulation of ordinary Black and brown people, but ordinary whites as well. Anyone who thinks that the antics of the former Trump administration and the ongoing Republican Party writ large is only about race is thinking too narrowly and ignoring that this tempest of racism and white nationalism is happening within the larger whirlwind of class warfare. What does class war look like? It's not envy or jealousy, as the right often says it is. It looks like the incomes of the top 5% of earners increasing faster than the incomes of other families. Since the Great Recession of 2008, the richest families, the top 5%, are the only ones to have gained wealth since then. From 2007 to 2016, the median net worth of the richest 20% of Americans increased 13% to $1.2 million. Meanwhile, the greatest loss of wealth, 39%, came from families who saw their net worth drop from $32,000 in 1997 to $19,000 in 2016. As a result, the wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families, or poorer families, more than doubled from 1989 to 2016. In 1989, the richest 5% of families had 114 times as much wealth as families in the bottom 20%, $2.3 million compared to $20,000. By 2016, this ratio had increased to 248 times. This enormous shift in wealth and resources from the bottom to the top has come with a steady erosion of public programs. That erosion, in some cases, the absolute demolition of the public sector and social programs aimed at easing inequality, has been hastened by the cynical innovation of race and the demonization of poor and working class Black families. Even where white families have benefited from the meager resources the United States affords to the poor and dispossessed, a bipartisan effort to paint various welfare programs as the root of the supposed indolence of unwed and supposedly uneducated Black mothers was deployed to undermine welfare as an entitlement for both Black and white families. The pernicious framing of, quote, personal responsibility to explain both success and failure within the United States has been used to chew away at the social ties that bind a society together. It was unleashed to corrode and transform King's beloved community into every person for themselves in this country. It has helped to explain as common sense the gross wealth inequality we see here as the natural outcome when some people work very hard and are thus rewarded with enormous wealth and the good life, and where those who were demonized as not working very hard, who are demonized as not working hard, suffer poverty that is invariably described as a result of their own fault. Indeed, these dangerous racial politics were the context within which the King holiday was signed into law by Ronald Reagan. Reagan, who had invented the fictitious character of the welfare queen to demonize African Americans using the publicly available services of the social welfare state, finally acquiesced in making King's birthday a national holiday to give himself cover during the first term he was politically assailed from the left for gutting the social welfare state. The elevation of the King holiday was used to diffuse the accusations of racism, even as Black families were assailed by an unfolding war on drugs inaugurated by Reagan and plundered by soaring unemployment and growing ranks of poverty. 2 years into Reagan's first term, Black unemployment had risen to 21% by 1983. It would go no lower than 10% by the end of the decade. The 1982 poverty rate of 14% was the highest since 1965 at the start of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. But for African Americans, the bottom was falling out as poverty consumed an astounding 30% of the Black population. The dull legacy of King and the deadening repetition of I Have a Dream was used as a weapon by the right to silence their critics as race baiters, allowing for the promulgation of a toxic colorblindness that dismissed Black suffering as irresponsibility and a product of broken Black families. Together, untenable wealth, inequality, in combination with the destruction of the social sphere, helped unleash historic levels of instability, anxiety, and anger. The right, led by Donald Trump, has tried to manage the growing storm with vicious racism intended to blame the most vulnerable as criminals, depraved, and dangerous, to explain both inequality, but to also justify the abuse of police and ICE officers. But Trump went beyond divide and conquer and blaming Black and Latino families for the crises in white America. He offered a narrative of white power to ordinary white people as an aspiration to achieve what they believed was a birthright for earlier generations. Making America great again, a slogan that Trump plagiarized from Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, is an aspiration to return to a time when white men were in firm control of the country, from the original frontier of manifest destiny to the new frontier of the post-World War II era. The enslavement of Africans or the extermination of the indigenous population and the super exploitation of Latino and other immigrant labor were simply the costs of establishing American greatness, and that the white men of the United States were able to carry this conquest out was in fact evidence of their greatness. In the post-World War II era, the extension of this greatness meant unfettered access to the social contract that the white American middle class grew out of. The New Deal, the GI Bill, homeownership, well-paying jobs with benefits, all the while white families were getting fat on the ideological offerings of the American state about the American dream and American exceptionalism and the greatness of the United States above all others. This mythology of the American past, built around a kind of capitalist realism of ascendant white American men, their doting wives and obedient children, is at the center of our national narrative, to the exclusion of everyone else. This is what it has meant to make America great again. The presence of African Americans and the struggles of African Americans have always interrupted this narrative lie. The mere presence of Black people in the United States created an originating paradox. How could the world's first representative democracy also be a slaveholding nation? The contradiction was explained with racism and the supposition that African Americans were something other than individuals who shared aspirations of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The violent exploitation of Black labor and the subjection of Black persons and the genocidal policies of indigenous expulsion have stood in contradiction to the stated ideals of the United States from its inception. And their resistance has not only exposed this narrative myth as a lie, but in doing so, it has provided a counter history of resistance and struggle in search of democracy, justice, and freedom. While American slavery and the racism produced in its wake has been described as an original sin, racial domination and Black subordination continued well beyond slavery, right into the modern era of the United States' development or ascension as the world's most powerful country. But it was the emergence of Black protest movements in the 20th century that upended the ideological foundation of the US as a superpower. The idealization of American democracy and freedom, the supposition of the US as a just nation, was a pretext for its interventions across the world. It justified its enormous investment in the military. It justified its bombardment or occupation of other countries. But that foundation for intervention was disrupted by Black struggle. The Black movement, first in the North, struggled for fair employment, for good housing, and in opposition to police brutality. And then again in the American South to end legal apartheid, disenfranchisement, and second-class citizenship altogether. This was not a preordained march towards progress. This was the march of the US disrupted by the advent of Black struggle and protest. King understood how these contradictions between what America said to the world, but what it did at home to Black people, created political vulnerabilities that could be exploited when exposed. As the United States began to act on civil rights and to abandon the backward ways of its southern region, it did so in ways to preserve as much of the status quo as possible, but to remove the potential for the South's backwardness to continue to act as a fetter on the US's diplomatic intentions. In an amicus brief submitted by the US Attorney General in support of the plaintiffs in the historic Brown versus Board of Education case, it read, quote, "The United States is trying to prove to the people of the world of every nationality, race, and color that a free democracy is the most civilized and most secure form of government yet devised by man. The existence of discrimination against minority groups in the United States has an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. Racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills." Even still, with so much at stake, state officials across the South and the federal government had to be pushed to change the laws that subjected African Americans to second-class citizenship well into the 20th century. Eventually, the South would relent as an avalanche of protests indicated that young Black people had lost their fear of the white establishment and would never submit to the coercive pressures that had terrorized their parents. Even with the pressures of Cold War liberalism to end Jim Crow, it still took events like the Montgomery bus boycott, the lunch counter protests, the freedom rides, and endless marches and demonstrations to dramatize Black humanity and articulate that Black people were deserving of freedom. But changing race relations in the United States could be done cheaply. You could change the law with no real commitment to improving the lives of Black people. Changing the law would no longer allow the enemies of the United States to point to the legally degraded status of African Americans as evidence of American hypocrisy. But African Americans were interested in much more than a change in legal language. They wanted access to the full range of benefits that were assumed to come with American citizenship. They wanted social mobility. They wanted self-determination. In less abstract terms, they wanted good jobs, good housing, good schools, and an end to racist police terrorism. They wanted the good life. King knew that his desire for a better life was not only in the South, but it belonged to African Americans across the country. 5 days after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law in August of 1965, South Central Los Angeles exploded in rebellion. There had been riots in Rochester, Harlem, Philadelphia in the summer of 1964. But the explosion in Los Angeles was on a scale and scope unseen in the United States in the 20th century. Over the course of 6 days, Black Angelenos rebelled against the vicious racist status quo. The results were devastating: 34 deaths, over 1,000 injuries, nearly 4,000 arrests, and the destruction of property valued at $40 million. King traveled to LA. He told reporters that the Watts riots were, quote, "the beginning of a stirring of those people in our society who have been passed by the progress of the past decade." Struggles in the North, King believed, were really about dignity and work rather than rights, which had been the main goal of Black activism in the South. During his discussions with local people, King met Black residents who argued for armed insurrection and others who claimed that the only way we can ever get anybody to listen to us is to start a riot. This was the beginning of an important pivot, not only in the tactical and strategic approach of King, but politically. There was a developing critique of racism and its connection to a political economy that kept it intact. When King left the South and headed to Chicago to join a campaign to fight a different kind of racism that did not mount signs designating segregated drinking fountains or in dilapidated neighborhoods, undoing When King left the South and headed to Chicago to join a campaign to fight a different kind of racism that did not mount signs designating segregated drinking fountains, but a racism that nevertheless forced Black families into segregated and dilapidated neighborhoods. Undoing the racism found in cities across the North required more than just changing the law. It required redistributing the resources and wealth. It required enforcing existing laws that banned the federal government from engaging in discriminatory actions that violated the 14th Amendment and its Equal Protection Clause. King understood this, and in an essay he composed at the end of his life, he wrote of this dynamic, quote, "All too many Americans," this is King, "all too many Americans believe justice will unfold painlessly or that its absence for Black people will be tolerated tranquilly. Justice for Black people will not flow into society merely from court decisions, nor from fountains of political oratory, nor will a few token changes quell all the tempestuous yearnings of millions of disadvantaged Black people. White America must recognize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. The uncomfortable, the entrenched, the privileged cannot continue to tremble at the prospect of change in the status quo." He continued, "When millions of people have been cheated for centuries, restitution is a costly process. Inferior education, poor housing, unemployment, inadequate healthcare, each is a bitter component of the oppression that has been our heritage. Each will require billions of dollars to correct. Justice so long deferred has accumulated interest, and its cost for this society will be substantial in financial as well as human terms. The fact has not been fully grasped because most of the gains of the past decade were obtained at bargain prices. The desegregation of public facilities costs nothing. Neither did the election and appointment of a few Black public officials. The price of progress would have been high enough at the best of times, but we are in an agonizing national crisis because a complex of profound problems has intersected in an explosive mixture. Over the course of the 1960s, the war on poverty and the Great Society spending programs could not keep up with the pace of Black anger. From 1964 through 1968, more than 500,000 African Americans were involved in more than 250 uprisings across this country. When a federal commission was paneled to investigate the causes of the rebellion, they sent investigators to all the cities where rebellions had exploded and interviewed residents. There were many reasons that motivated these uprisings, but three reasons that resonated in each of the cities was unemployment, substandard housing, and police brutality. As the Vietnam War developed over the course of the decade, it leached resources from this war on poverty to fund the military effort. King's political maturation prompted him to connect the US war in Vietnam to the deteriorating conditions in US cities. And of even more consequence, it prompted him to search for more effective tactics in confronting the legal menace of segregation in the North and the attendant crises, slum conditions, unemployment, and police brutality. Within this context, King began to publicly articulate an anti-capitalist analysis of the United States that put him in sync with the rising critiques from the global revolutionary left of market-based economies. Despite the affluence of the United States, it was nevertheless racked by poverty and entrenched in endless war. King masterfully tore down the wall that political and economic establishments used to separate domestic policies from foreign policies. He debunked the lie at the core of the Johnson administration that they could deliver both guns and butter. And he pointed out how the Vietnam War made it impossible to satisfy the deep need that existed on the home front. Moreover, any society invested in the evisceration of the Vietnamese people could not truly be a society committed to developing the human potential of its own people. As the Black movement moved into its revolutionary phase by the late 1960s, young African Americans, including King, had radicalized through their repeated encounters with the American state and its failure to produce substantive change. It would be wrong to say that there was no change over the course of the 1960s. Of course, there was lots, but none of it was enough. Liberals complained that the Black movement was demanding too much too quickly. But King condemned that line of reasoning in his much earlier letter from a Birmingham jail written in 1963, when he wrote contemptuously about, quote, the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. By the late 1960s, in the months and weeks prior to King's death, his view of the problems facing Black people became more complex and their resolution more complicated. The failure of the government to adequately provide for its citizens while lavishing the military with unquenchable human and financial resources forced King and others to come to the conclusion, to come to other conclusions about transforming the gross inequities of American society. For some young people, it led them to rebellion and violence against those who they believed to be responsible for their condition. For others, largely young people, many of them became anti-capitalist revolutionaries, convinced that American capitalism would never equitably share the spoils of its tremendous riches. King did not advocate riots. After Detroit and Newark, the most destructive rebellions of the period in 1967, he said in a speech to his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, weeks later, quote, occasionally, Negroes contend that the 1965 Watts riots and the other riots in various cities represented effective civil rights action. But those who express this view always end up with stumbling words when asked what concrete gains have been won as a result. At best, the riots have produced a little additional anti-poverty money allotted by frightened government officials and a few water sprinklers to cool the children of the ghettos. It is something like improving the food in the prison while the people remain securely incarcerated behind bars. Nowhere have riots won any concrete improvements, such as have the organized protests and demonstrations. But he also believed that it was the height of American hypocrisy to decry riots while this country's military was eviscerating Vietnam. It meant that the US government had no moral authority. For all of his critiques of Black political violence, he also understood its impact and also stood in solidarity with those who were rebelling. In an essay published a year after his death in 1969, he wrote, quote, I am not sad that Black Americans are rebelling. This was not only inevitable, but eminently desirable. Without this magnificent ferment among Negroes, the old evasions and procrastinations would have continued indefinitely. Black men have slammed the door shut on a past of deadening passivity. Except for the Reconstruction years, they have never in their long history on American soil struggled with such creativity and courage for their freedom. These are our bright years of emergence. Though they are painful ones, they cannot be avoided. In these trying circumstances, the Black Revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing the evils that are deeply rooted in the whole of structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws and suggests that radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. What this meant was that the Black movement was never a movement unto itself, interested only in a narrow set of demands. The state has always overreacted to Black struggle because of the way that Black social movements upend every preconceived assumption about American society. The Black movement shatters the illusion of the US as historically just because it is a reminder of the legacy of slavery. Contemporary Black movements against institutional and entrenched racism show that, again, the arc of American history is long and bends towards racism and inequality. When Black people deep into the 20th century and now into the 21st century must continue to fight for very basic rights and against very basic injustice, it is a reminder that American hubris and piety are unearned and unwarranted. Indeed, the struggles of African Americans expose the central mythologies of the United States as actually a scaffolding of lies and hypocrisy. These afflictions are not only the burden of Black people and other racially oppressed groups in this country. They are a problem for white people as well. To be enthralled by these lies and hypocrisy of racism, white supremacy, and the inherent greatness of the United States is also detrimental to white people who can never achieve the spoils of whiteness, who can also never achieve the spoils that whiteness is supposed to ensure, because American capitalism enriches only the few to the detriment of the many. And this is the heart of the matter. The problem that King of thousands of other revolutionaries from the 1960s in the United States unraveled. The problems in the United States were not just ones of ignorance. The problems of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism could not simply be solved by exposing them or comprehending them more fully. They had to be attacked at the root. King was his most eloquent when he got down to the root of the problem. Quote, this is from a speech he gave in 1967 at the Southern Leadership Conference, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Quote, as we talk about where do we go from here, we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the questions of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We are called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. And you see, my friend, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, make them into things, and therefore they will exploit them, and poor people generally economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else. And it will have to use its military might to protect them. You see, all of these problems are tied together. The lack of resolution to these issues by the end of the 1960s and well into the 70s has brought us to the moment we are in today. But as I begin today, these conditions of racism overlapping with economic inequality have combined in ways that have made African Americans more vulnerable to COVID-19. It has left them more likely to lose their homes to eviction, more likely to lose their jobs as a result, and lose their health care as a result. King's life ended both as he was trying to help organize a massive campaign of civil disobedience in the nation's capital, in hopes of coercing elected officials into producing even greater amounts of money, resources, and programs to stem the brutality of poverty in the world's richest country. King and SCLC called for what they described as massive civil disobedience to shut down business as usual in Washington, D.C., to dramatize poverty and inequality in the United States. He was also intimately involved in the campaign of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, desperately trying to win union recognition to raise their wages and force the white supremacist municipal government of Memphis to recognize their humanity. It was a movement in Memphis that united poor Black workers with the broader Black community on the basis of solidarity and unity. The withdrawal of labor by Black sanitation workers demonstrated that even the poorest and most marginalized of the Black working class had the power to bring the city to the negotiating table as trash piled up around town. But those workers were only able to survive the backlash of racist city authorities and white people in the city because the Black community rallied to their side. It became a community-wide struggle. And that brings me to the conclusion. These conditions we face today, institutional racism, white supremacy, police terror, poverty, inequality, and the unending death toll with COVID-19 will not end because they should. They will only end through struggle and what King described as the radical reconstruction of American society. And I will close with a short quote from him. This again is from a lecture he gave on the Canadian Broadcasting, for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in 1967. Quote, "We may now be in only the initial period of an era of change as far-reaching in its consequences as the American Revolution. The developed industrial nations of the world cannot remain secure islands of prosperity in a seething sea of poverty. The storm is rising against the privileged minority of the earth, from which there is no shelter in isolation and armament. The storm will not abate until a just distribution of the fruits of the earth enables man everywhere to live in dignity and human decency. The American Negro of 1967, like Crispus Attucks, may be the vanguard in a prolonged struggle that may change the shape of the world, as billions of deprived shake and transform the earth in their quest for life, freedom, and justice." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. I wish that we were in the Villanova room as we typically are, and we could hear this whole room of 500 folks thanking you for your remarks. But I speak on behalf of them and gratitude for the context that you've given us and the challenge in terms of thinking about progress and if that is the inevitable trajectory that this country is on, and what we need to do for radical reconstruction. So I want to turn this program now to the questions that are coming in. So please submit your questions, and I will deliver those to Dr. Taylor. So I'll start with this first question, asking you to expand on the importance of violence and its connection with political consciousness in the liberation of Black people, whether from capitalism, imperialism, militarism, neocolonialism, in a suppressive state, right?
I think, I mean, one of the things that King was responding to when he kind of took on this idea that the kind of inherent progressive nature of these uprisings was he was really responding to the politics of Frantz Fanon and the popularity of those politics, which Fanon was a radical psychiatrist who was a leader in the Algerian liberation movement against the French occupation of Algeria. And Fanon becomes this, international symbol of resistance, and his political writings are taken up by radicals and revolutionaries around the world. And one of them, one of the things that he argues for is violence as almost a process of cleansing the kind of either colonial or racist subjugation worldview from the minds, bodies, and experiences of the oppressed. And, King really rejects that and essentially says in a much more kind of practical or pragmatic way, how do we win the reforms, the radical reconstruction that it is that we are in search of? And for him, that was through the power of the mass movement on the one hand, and it was also about harnessing the particular power of labor and the realization that labor had disproportionate power because they held the lifeblood of our society in its hands. And so this is why, in that quote I have from him critiquing, criticizing the riots, he talks about how the most substantive changes have come through our mass movements. I think, there could be some challenge to that because he tried those same kinds of strategies of the mass marches and that sort of thing. In Chicago, for example, when he shifted his campaign to go to Chicago in 1966 to join what had been established there that was known as the Chicago Freedom Movement. And those tactics that had been very successful in the South, mass marches and that sort of thing, were not successful at all in Chicago. And it was very frustrating for King because he was trying to create an alternative to actually win young Black people away from rioting as the most successful method of political protest. And so I think towards the end of his life, being both witness to the power of even poor Black workers in Memphis, but also, really having tried to figure out what a mass movement could look like in the North that was effective, and where he landed on this strategy of massive civil disobedience in the Capitol, signaled that he was still on that trajectory of wanting to involve as many people as possible as the ultimate weapon that Black people had for achieving social transformation. This was, sort of where he landed towards the end of his life. And so I think that, this was a big political debate throughout certainly the late 1960s and the early 1970s, was the frustration at the slow rate of change, the recalcitrance of the US government, measured in the lack of really substantive reforms that come out of that period, forced people to come to even more radical conclusions about what they needed to do in order to achieve the kinds of changes that they were looking for. And this during a period of what was called third world radicalism, the power of anti-colonial struggles, whether it was the Algerian struggle, whether it was the Vietnamese struggle and their success in driving the United States out of their country. This was a period of colonial rebellion, and many radicals saw African Americans within the United States as a colonized population. And so the methods of anti-colonial struggle that were popular elsewhere became integrated into the discussion of what it is do we have to do here to challenge the political, not just status quo, but really a worsening, a deteriorating social, economic conditions for Black people. So those are some of the things that I think come up for me about that within this context of the 60s.
Terrific. We have another question here. What do you make of Stokely Carmichael's assertion that racism is not a question of attitude, it's a question of power? As in, is anti-racism simply an equitable redistribution of power / wealth, or does it require interpersonal connection and beloved community?
I mean, I think that Stokely Carmichael, Charles Hamilton write a book and that's published in 1967 that is really, one of the most important documents of the era. The book is called Black Power. And in that book, Carmichael coins the term institutional racism that we're all familiar with, that has recently become replaced, I guess, by this thing called systemic racism. And I call it this thing called systemic racism because, it's been invoked repeatedly without any, I think, real discussion about, well, what is the system being implicated in systemic racism? And what does it mean that someone like George W. Bush, who left office with a 28% approval rating, I think some people forget that. Other people, younger people who may not have been, politically aware or conscious at the time, don't know, because George Bush is treated like this kind of cute, sweet, doddering ex-president. George W. Bush was reviled when he left office in 2008. And before he was president, he was the butcher of Texas. He oversaw the execution of more than, or I think 152 mostly Black men in the state of Texas. And so when someone like that can just cavalierly throw around the phrase systemic racism, we need to do something about it. It forces us to call into question what does this term mean, and what is behind its invocation. And so what Carmichael was trying to get at with institutional racism was that, to some extent we needed to take the emotions out of racism, that we needed to depersonalize it, because I think, and it is certainly the case today, that people think that racism is only present if there is a cross burning, if the N-word is used, or if there is some explicit manifestation of racial hatred. And while those would certainly be emblematic of racism, we have to also look at questions of power and control and authority, and spend less time looking at intent and more time looking at outcome and effects. And when you have African Americans who are disproportionately impoverished, who are disproportionately suffering from unemployment, and when you go through all the social barometers that measure quality of life or equality in our society, and Black people continue to come out on the short end of that stick, or, um, you know, when Black people continue to be victimized by these kinds of disparities, then we have to identify what the reason for that is. And so over the last 40 or 50 years, the right and liberals, I will say, have offered an explanation, one in which involves critiques of Black families, critiques of Black culture, really ways that always circle back to blaming African Americans for their own condition. And part of the reason for that, and part of the power of Carmichael's description of institutional racism, was that if you can say that the system is racist, that the organizations, the institutions that govern our society are racist, then you have the right to make a claim for repair. You have a right to demand that those institutions fix the damage that they have created. Well, conversely, if you blame it on Black people, Black families, Black culture, Black neighborhoods, then really what you are asking for is, a personal transformation, personal responsibility, and is really the key to solving these problems. So by talking about institutional racism and removing it from, removing the emotion from that, then you are also making a claim for the government to act to repair problems that it was responsible for, or that it, in collusion with private sector forces, were responsible for. And I think that is part of the reason why there was such a concerted effort in the late 1970s and certainly through the 1980s to shift away from looking at outcomes and effects and focusing almost exclusively on intention as a way to explain the present, as a way to identify the presence of racism or to explain away racism as a phenomenon in American life. And so I think it remains a very powerful analytical framework for understanding racism in the American context. And, I think we have to still define, I think, what does anti-racism mean in that context? Is it just about, creating programs and finding ways to respond to racist injustice in the United States? To some degree, it is. But I think what King is also compelling us to do, certainly in the speeches that he's making over the course of 1967 and 1968, is that we have to look beyond issues of public policy. We have to look at the entire structure and makeup of our country, of our economy, and look at the ways that racism is structured into how we function as a society. And sometimes that's not just a question of public policy. That is an existential question about the nature of American society, which for King meant transforming the nature of American society. And that's more than a policy question. That gets to the root of how decisions are made. Are we going to remain a market-based economy? Or, all of these questions about the nature of our society, which is why King talked about a radical reconstruction of American society. He didn't talk about a radical public policy, bonanza in American society. a radical reconstruction, rethinking, a revolution in values in US society. And so I think he is compelling us to think deeply and hard about these questions and not rely on the same kinds of tools that we're used to.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here that
I'll try to give shorter answers.
Oh, no, this is great. So one is asking about what a young white person can do to bring about change in the mindset of other white people for the need for Reconstruction in a way that would be effective and respectful of the Black community. Another question is from a high school student asking, how can we work effectively as white allies to truly support marginalized communities?
Sure. So let me just say that I really hate the concept of allies. And I say that because I think that for some people, they interpret that as these are our problems and we need to help Black people with these problems. Not that they think that Black people are responsible for these conditions or anything like that. But I think white people need to start seeing how they themselves are impacted by what is happening in this country. And I think that that can sometimes be difficult for white students who are at elite universities. And that's not a slag on Villanova. I teach at Princeton. So I'm, surrounded by this constantly. But there is and I think part of the issue is that we have become so accustomed to seeing hardship and poverty as Black problems because that is how they are characterized in our society. And part of the end result of that is that Black people are pathologized. If you listen to some of this debate about reopening public schools or not because of the virus, I mean, some of the ways that Black kids are described as a lost generation, as how will they eat? How will they survive if they're not sitting in school buildings? It's almost as if they don't even have parents. It reminds me of the kind of moral panic of crack babies in the 1980s or super predators in the 1990s. These kind of children, these wayward Black children with no direction in life. And so there's the pathologization of Black people. But conversely, there is the invisibility of white suffering and poverty and oppression and exploitation on the other side of things. And, when I talk about capitalism is a system where the spoils are concentrated at the top. And at the top, about 98% white, that is true. But in the bottom, and those people who are also being strangled by debt, who are suffering from unemployment, from uncertainty, from insecurity, fear about the future, that's a lot of white people too. That's a lot of ordinary working class white people. I know that there's this weird taboo that we can't talk about economic anxiety because somehow it's believed to be letting the racism of the former Trump administration off the hook. But I feel like, we have to be more intellectually nimble than that. We can talk about both at the same time. We can talk about race and class. And the reality is that for millions of ordinary white people in this country, over the last several years, it's been reported that the life expectancy of ordinary white people has gone into reverse. This does not happen in the developed world. In the developed world, life expectancy does not go into reverse. It grows over time. And why is it going into reverse? Drug addiction, alcoholism, opioid, addiction, and suicide. These are not the markers of privilege. These are the markers of despair and pain and fear and anxiety. And so the question isn't, what can we do as white allies to help you poor Black folks? The question is, what are we going to have to do? What is necessary to change a society that is so contemptuous of human life that even people who are considered to be privileged are drinking and drugging themselves to death because they can't deal with it? And so we have to figure out what kind of movement we need to transform these conditions, because it's not just that, you can say that African Americans suffer disproportionately. Absolutely. Latinx people suffer disproportionately, unquestionably. We had a government that was locking up people across the border and had as a policy separating children from their families. Just diabolical stuff. And so I like to say that racism is Black people's burden, but it's all of our problem. When the political establishment can get away with spending $80 billion a year on maintaining a racist criminal justice system, then those are resources that are extracted from all of us. Those are resources that, are not being reinvested in our neighborhoods, in our schools to make our lives better. So we suffer from that, across the board. Some suffer more, but we're all suffering. And so we have to figure out how to build a mass multiracial movement that can transform life for all of us. Now, I do think that, there might be particular things that white people can do that, perhaps other activists can't. Clearly, we have to start going into the workplaces, into the communities of white working class, ordinary people who have been attracted to the ideas of Trump, who are attracted to the ideas of the right. I think that we're, sometimes on the left can be naive and, underestimate the extent that we are in a constant battle, ideological battle over ideas and how we understand what is happening in our society. And that means that we have to engage and contend and challenge the explanations that the right has put forward to explain the disorder in people's lives. And so to me, those are the kinds of questions and conversations we need to think about as we talk about what it means to radically reconstruct the United States.
Fantastic. So another question here asking you to speak a bit about where you see the coalescing of communities of support today for the struggle, akin to the community in Memphis that you spoke of.
Wait, say that again?
Sure. So where do you see communities of support coalescing today in a similar way to what you're describing in terms of Memphis, the Black community coming,
oh, sure,
the sanitation workers? Yep. Thank you.
I think that there's a lot of that. I mean, I think that this whole pandemic, because our government ceased to work or chose not to work, has been, there've been countless examples of, I think that we see this with the proliferation of mutual aid efforts. I think that the absence or abandonment of the government has, really put an onus on community organizing or communities organizing to, try to respond to the absence of any kind of organized intervention. I think, with some of the strike stuff, I mean, working class workers in particular have been under threat of, unemployment, which makes organizing difficult. But you can see right now in Chicago, where the city the mayor of the city, Lori Lightfoot, and the head of Chicago Public Schools have really, told public school teachers that they have to return to school to do in-person teaching. And they initially have tried to do this without any input from teachers and from their union, the Chicago Teachers Union. I think that over the last several years in Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union has really been a kind of prime example of what is called social justice unionism, or also bargaining for the common good, where workers take up not just bread and butter issues that affect them directly, but they take up issues that impact the community as well. And so, they went on strike in 2019 and argued, that a big part of the strike was that the city needed to come up with resources for the 17,000 homeless students that were in Chicago public schools, that they needed to have a sanctuary policy regarding immigrant and refugees in the city. I mean, things that just seem to have nothing to do with teachers, but these teachers see themselves as part of the community, and they see themselves as having particular power because they are organized within a union that gives them the ability to fight for things that other people might not be in a position to fight for. And, I think that is a really powerful example, because what it has also meant is that when they are engaged in a struggle like they are now over whether they will be, mandated to return to in-person teaching with no say over the conditions under which they have to work in a life and death situation, which is what it means to be forced to work during a airborne pandemic. I mean, it's crazy. That they have enormous community support. And so even with their threats to withhold labor, to strike, if forced to return to work, they have tremendous community support. The Chicago Tribune, which hates organized labor, hates teachers in particular, always does a poll to try to, get some numbers on the ground that show that, people in Chicago hate the Chicago Teachers Union. And it always fails. It always has that the teachers always have a majority of support. And why is that? It's because the teachers take care of their kids every day. So they trust their judgment much more so than elected officials who, tend to lie and cheat. And, the last head of they call the head of the public schools the CEO. But the person who preceded, the woman who is the CEO of Chicago Public Schools today, was prosecuted for accepting kickbacks by directing contracts, bids towards a consulting firm she worked for before she was the CEO of Chicago Public Schools. The spokesperson for the current CEO of Chicago Public Schools was just indicted on Friday for accepting bribes in an effort, for some corporation to get $1 billion bid on janitorial services. And so when it comes to who do you trust? Who do you trust with the well-being of your children? Teachers or, these people or the elected officials? I mean, but that trust has been developed because Chicago teachers have made clear through their actions, not through their words, but through their actions, that they're a community organization as well as a labor union. And so, I think that's a powerful example for unions across the country during a time in which it appears that, working class people are going to have to struggle for everything. I mean, we have a government that it is, at least it appears to be functioning now, but there's still a debate over, are they going to get $1,400 checks or, $600 or $2,000? I mean, these are nickels and dimes when the bottom of people's lives have fallen through the floor. And so the only way that dynamic changes is really through struggle and through the involvement of unions and community struggle. So I think that's kind of the future the immediate future that we're looking at.
Thank you. So we'll probably end here by 6:30. So we just have a few minutes left. We'll see if we can get one or two questions in here. One question is whether you have thoughts on how King's religious vision or vocation are connected to his radical political vision.
I think that, some of that becomes, confusing, I think, when you see some of the ways that religion is exploited today, in particular, with the kind of prosperity gospel and that sort of thing. But, I think King had a very kind of specific and radical view of Christianity. And, I think that was really at the heart of his politics, was an interpretation of Christianity, which was really about the meek inheriting the earth, and a profound sense of justice that comes from a particular, probably Old Testament inflected view of Christianity. And, I think that even as his politics were certainly radicalizing over the course of the 20th, over the course of the 1960s, that wasn't seen as contradictory for him. I think that, in some ways his politics were eclectic. I think that he was influenced by democratic socialist viewpoints. I think that he was certainly philosophically attracted to, and himself a pacifist. And so I think there are many different streams that fed his political consciousness, but at the root was a kind of a commitment to a radical Christianity that for him was really based on his interpretation of the teachings of Jesus Christ as also a kind of radical revolutionary. So I think that those things were tightly knit together.
Wonderful. And maybe a final question. There have been a few inquiries about what MLK would be saying today, and whether what changes could be expected from the new presidential administration, whether MLK would have openly supported that administration or have demanded radical policy proposals from it. So perhaps an amalgamation here of MLK in the moment and what we think of this current administration.
That's too many. I'm a historian, and that's just too many counterfactuals. What would MLK, who's MLK picking in the Super Bowl? I don't know. I think that, it's not about predicting what he would do today. It's about, what can we understand from his political commitments? What can we understand from, his speeches, his writings? I would encourage, the whole holiday thing and, I have a dream. People should read King. He was a brilliant writer. We're all used to the speeches, but his writing and, where do we go from here? What is the short one? Why We Can't Wait. I mean, these are canonical writings that give so much insight into, politics and consciousness and how people change and the possibilities. So I'll say that. I mean, I think with this administration, all of them, they have to be pushed to do the things that we want them to do. I think that there is a recognition from Biden, I think, thus far, that the Democratic Party will not survive a kind of weak, half-hearted effort at delivering the goods for people. I think that there is such deep suffering that there's an expectation that they have to do more, but their vision of more is not enough. And so, I think that there will be a tendency to view this administration just in contrast to the monstrosity that came before it. That's inevitable, but I think that we have to expect more. It can't just be, thank God this isn't Trump anymore, because that's not really going to get us anywhere. And so I think that, part of what has to happen is that, we need more spaces on the left to really talk about what it is that we want and how to project that into the public conversations in ways that the right uses the Republican Party to project its ideas. The Democratic Party, unfortunately, is not really conducive to that sort of thing, because it's a big, messy tent trying to hold a lot of different positions together, which usually ends up with muddled messaging, like searching for the soul of America, whatever that means. And so it means that we need, sharper politics and sharper interventions. And, we need to create the spaces for that, to really think about what it is that we want, and then to figure out how to act on that. And, we can use the writings of King to help influence the politics and our ideas about that, without having to think about what he would do in this moment, because he's not here. And, we don't need that model of what would this particular person do. We have a whole, history of movements and struggles to draw upon to really contemplate what is the most effective way to fight for the kind of society that we want. And so that's what I think that we should be talking about. And that, more than anything, is in the spirit of King.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. And what you've done for us tonight is open up a space to do that thinking, because, as you said, it's not just about what someone would have done, it's about what we are going to do, right? The work that we have to do, the imagination, the radical reconstruction. And so just want to thank you so much. You've really given us a rich, exquisite provocation. And appreciate your time and your presence, and thank you again for, on behalf of the hundreds of us who are here, even though you can't see them, and to you who are here. We are recording the keynote lecture this evening, so it will be made available probably about next week. We'll be sending that link out through our communications with CPJE. So thank you once again. Have a wonderful evening, and Villanova thanks you.
Thank you.